Life is encoded in the DNA sequence, and the DNA sequence is the code to put particular amino acids in order. And therefore, to find out the origin of amino acids is to find the origin of life. Now, before people knew anything about the biochemical things like amino acids that we now study, they didn't know what life was. They had simple conceptions of life, and they thought that it must come from a supernatural origin. And saying that life comes from a supernatural origin is, of course, very simple, but it pushes the idea of where life comes from back to another, even more difficult question. Where did the supernatural being come from? And so, what we have done is go back to biochemistry and try and work out where amino acids originally came from. The person usually credited with making the first real scientific attempt to work out where amino acids came from was Stanley Miller, a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And he got his supervisor, Harold Urey, interested in this, and together they embarked on a project to try and find out where the amino acids came from for the very first time. They studied evidence from rocks that were around at the time when they thought life had first begun, and they examined in those rocks the molecular traces of what the first atmosphere must have been like. And they came up with these 5 molecules that they believed formed a substantial amount of these early atmospheres. And they put all of these molecules together in about the concentration that they thought the early atmosphere might have been. And then they put an electrical discharge through this artificial atmosphere in order to simulate the effect of lightning, which they thought might be an energy source in order to stimulate the chemical reactions that perhaps led to the early molecules of life. For a long time, things did not look promising, but they kept their apparatus going for quite a long time, put more electrical discharges through, and kept feeding the early atmosphere molecules into their glass apparatus. And after a while, they noticed in one of the bottom vessels that it was turning a brownish black. Normally not a good sign, but in this case, it was a change, probably a sign of chemical change. And when Miller and Urey analysed the brownish black substance in the bottom of their apparatus, they found quite a lot of molecules that had not been there before, including, joy of joys, some amino acids, among them glycine and alanine, 2 of the amino acids that make up the molecules of life. They published their work, and they and other researchers began to work through the chemical processes that they thought might have led to the genesis of the amino acids. Carbon dioxide, for example, in the conditions of temperature and energy in which they put them, carbon dioxide would break down into carbon monoxide and the very short-lived elemental oxygen. That elemental oxygen is absolutely desperate to gain electrons, and so it's very, very unstable. And so it immediately reacted with another substance, CH4, or methane. And what happened there was a chemical process which resulted in the formation of water, but that was already there, but more importantly, formaldehyde, currently known as methanal by more up-to-date naming systems. But methanal is a sort of molecule based on carbon that can lead to further reactions. The other early product of that early decomposition of carbon dioxide was carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide is also quite reactive. It could react with ammonia, NH3, to form hydrogen cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide, of course, also has carbon at its center, and therefore could be considered a contender for the origin of the molecules of life. Another way that hydrogen cyanide could be formed, that's the HCN at the bottom of the slide, is by methane, CH4, reacting with ammonia, NH3. Hydrogen gas is given off, but we have more and more of the HCN produced. Now, you might normally associate hydrogen cyanide with being the kind of deadly poison that sometimes is used to get rid of rats in ships. However, it also appears to have a role in the generation of amino acids, and therefore the origin of life. At this stage of their studies, the scientists started to realize that they had formaldehyde or methanol, and that's the one in the top left, CH2O, and also hydrogen cyanide, and also in the early atmosphere there had been ammonia, NH3, and these could react in a truly surprising manner. When put together, they carried out a condensation reaction, and that's the water at right that they produced, but more so, there's a very interesting molecule that was produced. It's rather a complex one, and you can see that it joins two carbons together in a way that modern organic molecules do. More so, it has the NH2 group, the amino group. This perhaps was the beginning of amino acids. Miller and Urey and other researchers then put this proto-organic molecule together with more water. They gave it energy, they gave it the conditions of temperature and pressure which would lead to further reactions, and lo and behold, further reactions did take place. One product was ammonia, not of interest because we already had that. But the other product, well, have a look at it. It has a central carbon with two hydrogens attached. It has the amino group from one of the molecules that we put into this particular reaction, but it also has COOH. And that is a carboxyl group. So at one side there was an amino group, the other side there was a carboxyl group, and then a central carbon. So let's backtrack and have a look at how that molecule originated. So we started off with that proto-organic molecule based on two carbons and a nitrogen joined together. The right-hand carbon has a triple bonded nitrogen, and that makes a cyano group. At the left, there's the amino group, and of course, there's the central carbon. And when we look at the final molecule, that structural formula at the bottom, that's very clearly an amino acid. And that's what they were looking for. You can tell it's an amino acid because of the amino group at the left, NH2, the carboxyl group at the right, COOH, and a central carbon. This, of course, is the simplest of the amino acids, glycine. And this seemed to be the end of their quest. They'd found glycine, they'd found an amino acid. They also found several other amino acids, including alanine. This was absolutely wonderful and gave them a biochemical explanation of how Miller and Urey's experiment had come up with the dirty brown mess that included several amino acids. And everyone was satisfied with that explanation. There were a few scientists who maybe were looking at alternative explanations, but things were very quiet until one day, just above Australia, in September 1969, only 2 months after the first moon landings by Apollo 11, a meteorite fell to Earth. And it fell in a spot in Victoria, very close to where a young fellow called Nigel Crowe was living at the time, and he was very interested in this meteorite that had fallen to Earth. Many people were, because so many people were interested in space because of the moon landings. The falling of a meteorite to Earth seemed amazing to people. That meteorite came to rest in a big crater near the town of Murchison in Victoria, southeastern Australia. And of course, as soon as it cooled down enough to study, scientists converged on the scene and began to study it. And they found quite amazing things. They found amino acids. Now, at first people thought the amino acids had just come from the meteorite crashing into the ground, and some soil had got onto the meteorite, and the soil was from Earth, so it contained amino acids and sugars and things like that, because there were all sorts of organisms in it. And then people started to study the rest of the meteorite after it had been cleaned. They found, firstly, that there were quite a lot of amino acids. Then they found the age of the meteorite, and it was older than the age of the Earth. And finally, they found that quite a lot of the amino acids were not of a type that actually occurred on Earth. The amino acids must have actually come from outer space. And this took some people back to the supernatural explanation. They said, these amino acids come from space. The supernatural being has caused them to come to Earth. The genesis of life on Earth is simply caused because a supernatural being has caused a meteorite to land, and that is what caused life on Earth many millions of years ago, before this Murchison meteorite. But of course, this just set the real question back a few million or perhaps billion years. Where did the life come from originally? It must have originated somewhere in the universe. A process must have happened that caused amino acids to be generated. And what was that process? Scientists wondered anew. Then, in around 1976, hydrothermal vents were discovered. Hydrothermal vents are places on the sea floor where volcanic activity makes gases come from vents in the sea floor up into the water. This causes conditions of temperature and pressure and a mixture of molecules that did not occur elsewhere on Earth. One idea that came forward was the idea that conditions in the hydrothermal vents were the conditions in which amino acids had first formed on the ancient Earth. And if they studied these areas, these hydrothermal vents, they may discover the secret of the biochemical atmosphere that first gave rise to amino acids. And so initial analysis of the waters around the hydrothermal vents yielded, well, a mixture of gases very similar to what Miller and Urey first put into their apparatus several decades before. As further analyses were done, some very familiar molecules were found. At the left, it's not hydrogen cyanide, it's potassium cyanide, but it has that cyano group that appeared in some of the molecules that were important in Miller and Urey's studies. The central molecule there, formaldehyde or methanol. And finally, ammonia on the right. In 1992, Hennett, Holm and Engel decided to repeat the ideas of Miller and Urey, but with the hydrothermal vent. So they took the composition of the waters around the hydrothermal vent, recreated the energy sources and the temperatures and pressures, and placed those in apparatus similar to Miller's. They made sure, of course, that those molecules that had been identified before as associated with the genesis of amino acids would be placed in there as well. So there's our formaldehyde at the top, our ammonia in the middle, and our potassium cyanide at the bottom. And the temperatures with those appropriate to the volcanic atmosphere of the hydrothermal vents, 150 degrees Celsius. They gave time for biochemical reactions to occur, and it wasn't long before they discovered some. Those on the right are the structures of them, and they, of course, are amino acids. And there were several kinds of amino acids. 3 of them appear here, and you can tell they're amino acids because on one side there's an NH2 group, an amino group. Then there's a central carbon, and then on the right of our diagrams there's a COOH group, the carboxyl group. Coming from the central carbon is another variable group, and that's the R group. And the R group is what makes all of the amino acids different from each other. We now know, of course, that life is made up of 20 different amino acids. And we might think that this solves the issue of where amino acids come from. But of course, this was an experiment done in a laboratory under artificial conditions. They tried to make the conditions the same as in a hydrothermal vent, but we have not yet any evidence that the hydrothermal vent itself leads to amino acids without our laboratory intervention. It may be that the amino acids had their genesis in another situation entirely. And I don't suppose we'll ever have a real definitive answer, but we're getting reasonably close to a jolly good explanation. Tally-ho, all you chaps! Have a jolly good day.